Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, we really should have used the pen tool and those shape tools like the rectangle and the ellipse to have outlined different parts of our picture. If you look at my layers window over here, you're going to see that I've got a line for the eyelid, a line for the iris, which is the color part of the eye, the pupil, the eyeball itself, and the rectangle around the entire picture. All right, we want to be close. It may not be perfect, but we want to be close. And what I do recommend to all of you is that you go ahead and label these layers so you have it nice and organized the same way that I do. All right, to get started on our next step, what I'm going to do is, let's get us to a sort of full screen look. I want to go to these layers, and I want to get all of my shape layers at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the one above the background. I'm not going to include the background. I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and as I hold down Shift, I'm just going to click the top one. And by holding down Shift, it should have automatically selected all of those. So again, look at your background. Do not click on the background. Click on the layer above the background. And you should have it organized. It doesn't have to be in the same order that I have them, but you should have a rectangle layer, an eyeball layer, a pupil layer, an iris, and an eyelid. I'm going to go ahead now, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to click and select all of them. Once I have all those layers selected, you can see they're highlighted. I'm going to grab my Move tool. I'm going to make sure none of the boxes up here are checked. And that way I can just literally grab all those layers all at once and just slide them up to the top. We want to make sure that rectangle that you made pretty much fits on the rectangle on the top portion of the box. I'll go ahead, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You can see my rectangle probably is just a little bit smaller, but for the most part it's pretty much exactly where it was. You can see all my layers are selected. I don't want all my layers selected. Right now all I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on the eyeball layer. If you're having trouble, click on background and then on the eyeball. It should just be on your eyeball layer now. You'll know that because just that layer will be selected. I'm going to double check this before I start painting, but one of the important things I want to get is I want to make sure that my shape is closed. What do I mean by that? That there's no open gap at the end of it. Well, if you did it the way I did it, the only place there could possibly be an open gap would be right at the end, and if there was, you could use the direct select tool to go in there and sort of close that and fix that. But mine is kind of closed. Now what I want to do is I want to select this area just like we did for the apple. So I'll go back to my old magic wand tool. I'll click inside of that eyeball, not the outside. Outside you'll see everything is selected except here. I'll click on the inside. That should give you that moving outline, that dashed line just around that inside part. If you click on this part and everything gets selected, well, that means there's an opening somewhere in your outline and you've got to go look to close it. We're going to start by painting the eyeball part, the white of the eye first. That's going to be the first part of this painting. So to paint, I can't paint on the shape layer. I'm just going to go ahead, while I'm still on this layer, I'm just going to create a new layer down here at the bottom. When I click on that, it'll be layer 1. And I'll just call this whites of the eye. Okay, so we just keep things labeled. It makes things easier. Now what I want to do is I want to start painting. I'm going to go ahead and start for the white of the eye. I'm going to start with white. I'm going to grab my brush tool. And what I want to do is I want to start with I like to work with a big brush first and then slowly get smaller and smaller. So for me, I'm going to pick a brush somewhere between 150 and 200. It doesn't matter. Somewhere in there you can see what I've got. The hardness on that brush should be pretty low. It could be 0. It could be like 10 or 15, but I wouldn't go up over 20. Just something, a low hardness, nice and soft brush, nice and big brush, about 176, anywhere between 150 and 200. Then I'm going to go to my opacity and my flow. The higher this number is for each of them, the more paint comes out and faster. I like to have a lot of control and build up slowly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my opacity at like 25%, and I'm going to keep my flow at 20. So if those numbers are different for you, you should change it. They could be close. It doesn't have to be 25. It could be 26. It could be 23. But let's try to keep it around 25% for the opacity and 20% for the flow. Again, we're going to start with white first. If you're not selected on white, make sure you're selected on white. I'm going to look at my picture down here. Let's see, well, the white of the eye is pretty dark on this side, darker than the gray I have. But it's a little bit lighter than the gray I have on this side. So I'm going to go ahead with my brush. I'm going to see as I go over this area, I'm going to get a little lighter and lighter. And again, I really like to have a lot of control over my brush. That way it won't get too light too fast. I don't really think I need white on this side at all, although I see like a little bit of a light halo down over here. So I'm going to put a little bit of white, knowing full well that I can make it darker later on. Now you can see I'm sort of painting over the iris part. That's totally fine. You shouldn't have to worry about that right now. But right now I'm just working with the white. I think that I kind of want to make some of this area just a little bit brighter. I'm going to look at the little eye muscle over here, and even though there's a lot of shadow down there, there is some brightness, so I'm going to add a little bit of white just as my base for these areas down over here. Now, what I want to look at is that if I look at my picture, I've got some real bright highlights. Right? So a couple parts that are really, really standing out for me. So what I want to do is I think I'm going to make my brush a bit smaller to make those highlights. I'm also going to make my brush a little harder because you see some of those things have like kind of hard edges to them. So I'm going to make my brush a little harder. I'm going to go ahead down here and I'm going to try to make that some of those little highlight parts. There's another one that's right over here. I'm just going to kind of go over with my brush a bunch of times. I got a little bit of highlights in here. And this is a part where I could actually up the opacity and up the flow a little bit if I really have a high reflected area. Go ahead and you see that'll make some of this a little bit brighter and wider. You see a little bit of what I'm doing right now. I'm just trying to get a similar look to what I see on the actual picture. I'll adjust the size of my brush here and there. I'm going to make some of those little lines and marks. I've got my little bright highlighted area. I got some of these little highlighted marks. Got some highlights down over here. And I think I'll make just one more little skinny little mark. I'll look for all the little bits of white that I can find. Okay. Now what I want to do is I kind of want to come in and start doing some of the dark parts. Now you see I've got some darkness in and around these parts. This side's obviously darker. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to get my opacity again down pretty low, like 25-ish. My flow really low, around 20. Make my brush big again. Nice and soft, nice and large. And now I'm going to switch over to black. A little bit of black goes a long way, so I'll go in here, and on this side of my eye I see a little bit more darkness. And again, each one of your pictures is going to be a little bit different. So just because this is the way I'm doing mine doesn't mean that's how the lighting is on yours. Everybody's going to have a slightly different picture. A little bit of darkness on the top over here. I'm going to add a little bit to that. Maybe just a little touch down here in the bottom. Making it a little bit darker. Got a lot of little kind of detail kind of things here, so to maybe do some of that shadow. I'm going to make my brush a little smaller, a little bit harder. And I'm going to go in those corners and just try to darken some of that up. By going over it and over it, I'll just make it a little bit darker at a time. And I'll go ahead and try to create that little effect of having sort of tear duct. See a little bit of shadow and gray in here, so I'm going to take that smaller brush and add a little bit more there. And again, it really doesn't matter what you do over here, but I'm not ignoring this area. Actually, some of my colors bleeding over it, but that'll be fine, and I'll show you later on what we'll do with that. I'm going to go ahead and really kind of get a little, because I can, I'm going to get a little bit darker in there with a little bit smaller of a brush. I'm going to shrink my brush down, up the hardness, and I'm just going to kind of draw in my little tiny separations there, little sort of creases and edges. And again, I think working with a small thin brush, or at least not going too dark too fast, the low opacity and the low flow, you can kind of get in there and really sort of paint a little bit. And I think I could probably stop now, but you know what, I don't want to come back and just add just a little bit more white in there, so I'm going to switch back to my white. Let's stick with a small brush, maybe a little harder, and I'll go ahead and try to add those little details. So again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to emulate the little bit that I see over here as far as light and dark, and all I'm worried about right now is just painting the whites of the eyes. I'm not doing anything in there with the actual color of the eyes or the pupil of the eyes yet. This layer is just going to be the white of the eyes, and if you notice, I did a little bit of black and a little bit of white on there. I'm not going to get it exactly the same as this picture. I mean, that's going to be a very hard to do. And my expectations is that it's not perfect, but you get the basic sort of setup over here of what you see. And you could play around. You could add as much detail or as little detail as you want to this. But right now, all we're worried about is basically just the white of the eyes. And again, it is okay if you get paint in this area. This area is going to get covered up later on. I'm going to do a demo for how to do this and how to do this tomorrow. I think this is a lot just for today. So when I'm done with this part and I've got it the way I like it and the way I want it, I'm going to go ahead and save it as a PSD. I'm going to go ahead here and just zoom out a little bit. And then I'm going to take my screenshot as I always do. And this will be a separate assignment, and that will be just painting the whites of the eyes. All right, and I hope that was helpful. Please take your time with this. Again, we have plenty of time to get this done.